Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome once again. It's Torah study at Valley Beth Shalom. We're here online for only a little while longer, actually, because the world is opening up. So I'm delighted to be with my two friends and teachers, Rabbi Sherry Hirsch, newly of Maui, but back here in Los Angeles. You look rested and relaxed and tanned. It's wonderful.
That's what Maui does for you.
Unbelievable. That's why God gave us that island. It's really
Seriously.
there's a
Special
Jewish
place.
one. Did you know there's a Jewish island there? It's called Alavai. It's the Jewish island of Alavai. And Rabbi Mark Gelman of South Florida, late of the Temple Beth Torah of Melville, New York, and great scholar and teacher of Jewish thought and philosophy. Mark, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom. So this morning we are deep into the stories of Bamidbar, the stories of the wilderness. Bamidbar is the fourth book of the Hebrew Bible, the fourth book of the Torah, and it takes us across the wilderness on the journey from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. But to get from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land, you've got to cross this wilderness. And as we've pointed out in previous weeks, the wilderness isn't just a place. The wilderness is the human condition. How do you create the promised land? How do you create the sacred society, the just community out of ordinary folks who have been through the trauma of slavery, who have been through Exodus, who aspire to be a holy people, but are so far from it? And this is the great struggle that Moses has, and the struggle falls deeply on him. So we've seen in these last weeks, it's a sort of guided tour through the dark side of the human condition, the dark side of the human soul. First, the fear that prohibited the people from entering the land, brought on by the report of the spies who said the land will never be ours. And then the triple rebellion of Moses's tribe, of the leaders of the community and of the tribe of Reuven, the triple rebellion of the people who said, we don't want to follow you, the envy and demagoguery of Korach. And now we come to a third episode, as it were, in this sort of guided tour through the dark side. And it begins with a very, very strange law. Torah says, a person who touches anything dead, a dead body, or is in the presence of death, is contaminated and unable to participate in the ritual of the sacrifice, which is the principal religious ritual, a spiritual discipline of the community. So in order to wipe away that, as it were, stigma of death, you are to take a cow, which is entirely red, and according to the Talmudic tradition, has no more than 2 hairs on it that aren't red. You take this cow, you shech this cow, you sacrifice this cow, you burn up this cow, you dissolve the ashes in water, and now with magic red cow water, if a person is contaminated by the presence of death, you spritz this water on them, and you end up with purity. A sense that the person is able to participate in the sacrificial worship of the community. And it's it's strange law. I mean, there's a paradox in the law that the guy who does the sacrifice, the priest who carries out the sacrifice, is himself contaminated, which is kind of odd. It's like, why would the guy who holds the soap need to use soap to wash his hands? But the real interesting piece of this is that's not what the Torah is really talking about. What it's talking about is death itself, and loss and grief and the brokenness of what it means to confront mortality, to confront the fact that we're not infinite, the fact that we have limited time in this world. We all have a fantasy. I think every human being is fantasy. I'm going to live forever in some sense. I'm going to conquer death. And my son Yona once made a drasha on this Parsha, which I thought was kind of ingenious. He said to the community, you know how many hairs are on a cow? A lot. You know what the chances of finding a cow that only has 2 hairs that aren't red? 0. So what is this really about? It's the Torah's way of saying, I know you want to escape from this, but that's not possible. This is part of the human condition. And you are going to have to find a way to move past your fear and your fear of death, and what death does to you. Move past the absurdity, the crazy absurdity that we only live for a short amount of time in the world, and find ways to find meaning in your existence despite loss and despite death. And that's what the Torah portion then goes on to talk about, because it talks about 3 episodes that touch on death. We're going to experience the death of Aaron, the brother of Moses. We're going to experience the death of Miriam, the sister of Moses. And we're going to experience the moment at Meribah when the people complain and Moses smacks the rock. And he's told also, you will not see the promised land. You will die here in the desert. The question is, how do you still find meaning? How do you move forward in life? How do you say yes to life when the darkness, the shadow of death has cast itself upon your existence? And this is a very important question for this moment. So good morning, Sherry. Welcome back.
Nice to be back. Thank you, Eddie and Mark. Nice to see you both. I'm so profoundly moved by this Parsha because, as you said so beautifully, Eddie, that this one is about grieving, right? Moses, the great, doesn't get to go into the promised land. Even him is going to have a death of his dreams, right? Aaron dies in this Parsha. It's the end of his reign. Miriam dies, and the grieving is immense. As you know, they grieve for Aaron 30 days, much longer than for Moses, because they say he was the man of the people. But I think what's relevant for us is we've been in a wilderness, and now we're coming out, and how are we emerging? What losses are we leaving behind? And what deaths are we still grieving? I mean, literal deaths. We have 600,000 people have died because of COVID, but also deaths of jobs, death of dreams, death of all kinds of things that we thought we were going to do in 2020 that we didn't do. And I think this is a very telling Parsha in this moment, that not only do you have to grieve, but all things come to an end. And yes, I can say, and that opens the door for new beginnings. But before we go there, this is the Parsha that says leadership comes to an end, dreams come to an end. And it's not to be morbid, it's that everything has a shelf life, even our humanity, which is painful, gripping, challenging. I mean, this is why this book continues always to be my favorite, because every single story in Bamidbar is one that is extremely poignant.
And then the question is, how do you move forward? I mean, the real interesting, the powerful moment of the Parsha is that Moshe is going to experience these 3 tragedies: the loss of his sister, the loss of his brother, and the loss of his dream. And then he tells the people, we're moving forward. And you and I, Rabbi Gelman, have certainly, we've been with families who have suffered. We've been with families that have had horrendous losses. And I'm always it's so remarkable to me that they take a step forward. You know, that you're allowed to sit Shiva for 7 days. And the idea is that after 7, you get up.
You get up.
And it's an act of will, and it's tremendous act of courage. Please.
And I would just say about that is, on the one hand, the obvious answer is the Torah showing us that if Moses can get up, then we all can get up. But I actually think it's the inverse. Right? Of course, Moses can get up. He's the person, but it's that all the people follow him when he gets up. It's that he gets up because he's Moshe Rabbeinu, but they follow him and keep going because they're like us. They know that they haven't reached the destination. The story continues. They're mid-chapter, and as painful as it is, they still have a promised land waiting for them. And it's not to be so metaphoric, but it really is telling.
No, the person dies, but the dream doesn't die. In fact, that the idea is to invest yourself in a dream that outlasts yourself is really what I think one of the lessons of the Parsha. Mark, we have in this Parsha a story, and it's paradox. It's strange on many levels. First, because it repeats itself in the Torah, and second, because, well, I mean, in a certain way, every time I read this, I say, like, I want a different ending, right? You know, God condemns Moshe to die in the desert. I was like, no, let him go and sneak into the land and live on the boardwalk at Netanya and be one of those little old guys who walks around and play chess and drinks espresso on the boardwalk of Netanya, and let him live there. I still think he's there, by the way. I really think God led him in the land, but that's what I wait for every year. And I get to that point when God says you're condemned, and it just breaks my heart. Talk to me about this story. What does this story mean?
I agree with Sherry. This book, which is on its surface a boring book of ritual practices that are all gone from Judaism, is in fact deeply, existentially, personally powerful. I believe that, and I agree with that. And I think the most powerful story in the entire book is the waters of Meribah, the Meribah. In Exodus chapter 17, verse 5, right coming out of Egypt, we have the people complaining that there's no water. Now, Eddie, you've gone into this often, the Jews are kvetchies, and they're always kvetching about something. And they're kvetch about no garlic and no meat. I think probably you're right about that. But if you're in the desert and you have no water, saying to Moses, hey, we're going to die here if we don't have water, to me is not an excessive demand. You need water to live. So what they're complaining about is they're about to die. And God agrees with them and says to Moses, hit the rock, and the rock will split apart and water will gush out, and it will water a pool, and the people can get water from the pool. So that's the story of the waters of Meribah. This exact story, the same place occurs here in Numbers 20, verse 7. And they need water, and there's no water, and they go to Moses. Why'd you bring us here? We're going to die in the desert. And they go through their whole thing. And Moses says, I can't stand it anymore, and as he always does. And God says, all right, speak to the rock, and it will yield water. And Moses screams at the people, shall we, you donkeys, I think the right translation couldn't go into the Torah, but you donkeys, should we bring water for you again? Is that what you want? That I'm supposed to take care of your every need? And Moses takes his staff and hits the rock, and the rock gushes forth water, and they drink. And then God says, because you didn't see fit to affirm my sanctity among the people, you will not enter the land. So those are the two stories. They're the same. And the big question is, why are there repeating stories in the Torah? And what does that teach us? The possibility that they just forgot that there was a previous story is not realistic. So there has to be a reason. And I wrote a midrash for Moment magazine, one of my adult midrashim, modern midrashim, and it was about this. So in brief, this is my theory. There had to be something that came between the first waters of Meribah and the second incident of the waters of Meribah. What was that? Well, it was Sinai and the revelation of the law. So the most important difference between the two stories is that in the first story, the people hadn't reached Sinai yet, and they didn't understand that God had intended at Sinai for the exodus from Egypt to reach a different level. Now it wasn't just using force to emancipate the people physically from the house of bondage, the first stage of the Exodus. Now it was going to be the law, God's words, God's teachings, God's ethical, categorical imperatives that would make the people free. And that would be the second stage of the Exodus, which was to take Egypt out of the people, to make them free. That's what God intended. And Moses threw a wrench into that plan by hitting the rock a second time. Now, the commentators don't really speak much to the fact that there were two stories. They don't speak much to the injustice of having Moses forbidden to enter the land because instead of hitting the rock, which he had been commanded to do in the first story, but rather speak to the rock, and he forgets, he gets confused, and he's punished. So that's the first problem of the justification for punishing Moses. But for me, the deeper and most important message of the story is that it's a story about our use of force, physical force, psychological force, bullying, class privileges, all sorts of ways that we use force to compel people to do what we want. What God wants is for us to renounce force. And I believe that the Torah is, at its root, a nonviolent book, a book that, just like it is at root a vegetarian book, but instead of being a law as it is in Hinduism, or in some forms of Buddhism, some forms of Hinduism and all of Buddhism, that you should always be vegetarian, Judaism has always had a two-level law, a sort of lower law in which, well, if you need to use force, you use it. If you need to eat meat, you eat it. And a higher level, which is if you really want to free yourself from the Egypt that's within you, not the you that was in Egypt. If you want to really emancipate yourself, you have to renounce force. And the rabbis, I think, understood this lesson of Meribah, and there's evidence for it. They chose, for example, for the Haftorah for Hanukkah, where we're celebrating a military victory, after all. They chose Zechariah, Lo b'chayo, lo b'choach, ki'im beruchi, not with force and not with might, but by my ruach, spirit, inspiration, law, you will succeed. And that's the lesson. Lo b'chayo, lo b'choach. In fact, we know this also from another clue. When Moses was talking to God before he went to Egypt. And God says, you go to Egypt and tell the people, get out of there, I'm your God, and leave. And Moses says, listen, they don't know about you, and they're not going to leave, and they need a show of force that will be superior to Pharaoh, and that's the only way they'll leave. So God says, oh, all right, throw your staff down, turns into a snake, and God gave Moses the signs and wonders. So that was a tragic move. It was a necessary move, but a tragic move. And that's the incredible profundity of this story. And that is, it's not that force is bad. It's necessary to liberate yourself in a world where you have real enemies who want to kill you. It's that force is sadly necessary, unfortunately necessary in our broken world, and that we should be working toward a world where God's word alone, God's spirit alone will help us to prevail.
So the question is, why does the water come out of the rock if he didn't want him to
That's
hit it?
a great question. That is a great question. And I think that, in other words, why didn't God say, hey, I'm not going to go along with you're disobeying me. You're hitting the rock, and I said, speak to it. It's not going to give any water.
Right.
There's several reasons for that. First, the ambiguity of force that I tried to.
No, I think that's a substantiation of your thesis, right?
Yes, it is. The second is, if the water doesn't come out, the people die. And God has kind of been trapped. God is basically being blackmailed by God's own power. Because if the people die, and Moses told him this last week, listen, God, yeah, they'll die.
Or they'll kill Moses. I mean, he was also
whatever.
They're going to kill. If they don't see water, they're going to kill Moses, right?
Exactly. But then the non-Jewish world will say, look at this God. Look
Yeah.
at this God. He took them into the desert to kill them. So we're supposed to worship a God who took them into the desert to kill them? I don't think so. So God is trapped. Everyone is trapped. And that is the agony of force. That's why when you're talking to a pacifist, the first thing that you say in a debate is, what about Hitler? What about Hitler? Wouldn't you fight to destroy Hitler? And the answer, of course, is yeah, you have to fight to destroy Hitler, but it doesn't mean that you do it joyfully, victoriously, triumphantly. You do it with a great sadness. There's a whole bunch of stories about shoftim, about how you hire a shofet, a lot of Hasidic stories, how the Rebbe's wouldn't hire a shofet who didn't cry when he slaughtered the animals. And I think that's the agony of force. The agony is we need it, but it destroys our deeper soul when we use it.
I would just add to that, Mark, the natural consequence for Moses disobeying God would have been not to have water come forth from the rock. It would have shamed Moses right then and there. It would have been a clear, like we talk about as parents, what's the natural consequence, right? The natural consequence was not, and now you will not go into the land. The natural consequence is don't provide the water. But there's a moment, what you just said so beautifully is that God has to look beyond that natural consequence because it has a series of reverberations that are not natural consequences. And so God's put himself into a rock, between a rock and a hard place. So I think that was just very well articulated.
That's a good name for the Parsha, between a rock and a hard place.
Oh, that is a good name for the Parsha.
So Sherry, let me ask you a question, because I think I want to extend Mark's wonderful drasha. Why doesn't Moses just sit down at this moment and die or refuse to move? What is he thinking, and where does he get the strength, and where do any of us get the strength when we've experienced such a disappointment, life is so turned dark, to get up and say to the people, okay, now we're moving forward? Where do you've worked with people in these circumstances, you've written about this. Where does that come from? What is the thought pattern?
Not only have I written about this, but this particular story has resonated in my mind and continues to resonate all the time, because I think at this moment, Moses has a legitimate claim to say, and I'm out. I'm done, right? Like, okay, I lost my temper. I'm done. The people have been complaining. I'm out. And he has a very strong, legitimate claim. And what Moses does in that moment is he doesn't rely, as you said so beautifully earlier, on the legitimacy, but on the future dream. And I think so often in life, in that moment, we are incredibly legitimate for saying, I'm done, I'm out, I'm quitting, it's enough. And at that moment, what gives Moses the strength, in my perception, is the dream is much greater than him. And he realizes he's both smallness and his essentialness to fulfilling that dream. And I think when I've counseled people in my own life, when I wanted to say, like, enough, I'm legitimately reached the exit door. Am I focused on me, or am I focused on the larger dream? And the perfect example I will give from my own experience is, as you know, my mother, I talk about her a lot because I just loved her, and we just celebrated her birthday. But she died 6 months after Levi was born. And every bone in my body did not want to get up out of bed every morning. I literally did not want to physically get up. And I would remember waking and just wanting to pull the covers over me. And there was this 6-month-old infant that I couldn't even explain. My other children I could explain, but the dream of raising him was much greater than the pain of that moment. And I remember thinking literally about this moment when you have to sacrifice your own legitimacy of sadness, grief for something greater.
Yeah, you have to move yourself into a different place, a
Yeah,
completely different place.
I had a theory about that that I included in the Midrash. This very question, your wonderful question, why didn't he just say I'm out? And I think it goes to this question. It's an ancillary question of this story. Why did Moses hit the rock? Right? There's only several possibilities. One is he got confused because he had been ordered to hit the rock before. Now he's ordered to speak to the rock. It seemed like such a small difference, and he hit the rock by mistake. It was a mistake.
Oh, wait, can I interrupt you for just a quick second? In both cases, he was told to take the stick. The second time he was told, take your stick and go to the rock and speak to the rock. Now, if God really didn't want him hitting the rock, why take the stick? What are you doing with a stick in your hand?
Right. There's a legitimate confusion on his part. Like, you don't take a stick to talk.
Right.
Yeah. But I took the typical Gelman contrarian view. I said, nope, can't be that. Moses is never confused. Moses is depressed, but Moses is not confused.
He's devastated. He's devastated. Just like the sister.
But
his sister played a role in his life, which was critical.
Yes. And you both beautifully talked about the grief element in this story. I have a different theory. My theory, let's follow this one. Moses struck the rock on purpose. On purpose. And why? Well, first is Sherry's beautiful answer. Moses knew there were other fish to fry, larger goals. And that larger goal was the conquest of the land. Moses knew that this business that God had, just as God's idea of getting the people out of Egypt without force was naive, God's idea of conquering the land without force was also naive. Exactly the same naivete by, let's remember, the only two beings, one not a human being, God, and the other a human being, sort of, Moses, who were not slaves. So they had no clue about what it meant to be a slave. How do you get out from things like? So my theory is that Moses came back at God and said, oh yeah, I'm not through. You're through. If I can't enter the land, that's fine. I disobeyed your little teeny weeny command and you don't want to let me in, that's fine. But you're not entering the land either. I forbid you, I, Moses, forbid you, God, from entering the land with the people. And that is because you were not able to teach them about the use of force. So God agrees and understands the ambiguous nature of force and of God's own essence. And God says, all right, I'll split myself in two. I'll be the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the male aspect of God. That will go into the land with the people. But I will also split off my feminine part, which is my Shekhinah, and that part will go into exile with the people until the Messiah comes and we can unify, as we say in Lecha Dodi, which is the foretaste of the Messianic age, the unification of Kucha Brichu Ushkinte, the unification of the Holy One, blessed be God and the Shekhinah. So I believe that this is the beginning of the bifurcation of God pending the Messianic age.
Between love and power.
Yep.
This is the bifurcation.
Exile with us, power goes into the land, and Israel becomes a country of power manipulation. And in a certain way, it's the same today.
It still is. We are all discovering when you apply love and when you apply power.
Exactly.
And how to reconcile, how to bring the two together, how to reconcile the two aspects of divinity, which is really two aspects of humanity.
Yes.
In the conduct of a community.
Hallelujah.
Mark, I wanted to just
that's the midrash, Eddie.
I just wanted to jump on something you said at the beginning of what your last little vort, which is that you're being contrarian and that Moses intentionally hit the rock. I actually don't think that's being contrarian. I think God placed this, he said, grab the stick. So it was a little bit of a setup.
Yes.
Moses was completely frustrated. So I actually think that this is, just adding to what you just said, is Moses saying, God, I'm taking some of the power here. I've been following you. We're leveling up. It's no longer just you directing the show. We're leveling up, and we're going to have I'm going to have a voice or some power in this game. And I think that's goes right to your love and power thing. I think it's Moses leveling up.
And the Moses who we meet now from this Parsha forward is a very different Moses than we met before.
That's a beautiful point, Eddie. Beautiful.
Because the Moses we're going to meet now has a kind of self-confidence, and I think self-possession is the word. He's in charge, and he's in charge of himself, and he's embraced something in himself. And you get a different sense of the Moses who's going to confront for Og and Sihon, the kings of the desert tribes, the Moses who's going to confront Balak and the Moabites soon, and the Moses who's going to stand in front of the people at Deuteronomy and offer his words to the people.
And we've seen that in our own lives when people go from being tentative, insecure, not really embodying their position, to literally holding the space, being confident. I mean, you hear that with rabbis all the time. A new rabbi comes in and they're like, shaky and what, and then you see them transform in front of you. And I think that's also a message of the Torah in this Parsha.
But it's wonderful. Mark's paradigm of this, of recognizing both power and love as two necessary, it's a dialectic, as it were. It's a connect, it's a tension, as necessary elements in his leadership. And as you said, of confronting his mortality and realizing that he's not living for his own ambition anymore. He's not living for himself anymore. Now he's pursuing the dream. And as far as he can take the dream, that's his job. And if he can take it all the way to the boundaries of Canaan, the promised land. And listen, you know what, for any of us, if you were told your kids will go there, but you won't, any of us would take that bet in a minute. Anyone would accept that deal. If my children get to live in the promised land, don't take me, I can live without it. But promise me that my kids will make it.
Yeah, I think there's another element too that I've just sort of been thinking about, and that is, what is the prohibition about going into the land? Until Moses figures it out in this Parsha, in this story. The prohibition about entering the land is that we know God's entering the land with the people. And if you can't enter the land, you know what that means? You can't be with God. As soon as God says to Moses, a part of me will stay outside the land. A part of me will not go into the land until the Messiah comes. Then Moses can change. You can be more self-assured, more confident, less grieving, because Moses knows that a part of God will always be with Moses, even if Moses can't enter the land.
Go ahead, Cher.
Eddie, you said something else that really struck a chord, which is that Moshe, when God first approaches him, it's all about him. I can't do this. I'm not the right person. A lot of I's. I have a speech stutter. I can't. He would be even more legitimate, as I touched upon earlier, to say, I don't want to do this anymore. I am out. But the transformation of Moses, he doesn't even go to that habit that was ingrained in him when he was young. He's actually evolved into a different human. And so he's left the I mode and has entered the greater good mode.
Right. And if we can extend the sermon, which is we've just gone through a collective catastrophe with pandemic and the loss of so many friends and the loss of so many moments of life. And if we come out more committed to the dream, then we will have survived this and healed in a very powerful way. So thank you to Rabbi Hirsch. Thank you to Rabbi Gelman. It's wonderful to see you. Next week, we're going to take up the wonderful fairy tale of Bilam and Balak in the Torah. But next week's going to be our final session for the season. Then we're going to go on a little bit of hiatus. Let the rabbis have some time to rest and renew, and we'll continue Torah reading, that Torah study into August as we get closer to.
So many people are asking, Eddie, we'll have some real plans coming up about what's next, but we
We're-
want to make sure we thank everyone for listening. We hear from you all the time, and we are incredibly grateful.
Friends all across the country and all across the world, and we're so delighted to have you. And we'll figure this out. We'll be together.
So stay tuned for that.
Stay tuned for that. So thank you, Rabbi Gelman. Thank you, Rabbi Hirsch, and to everyone who's listening. Shabbat Shalom. Following this Torah study, of course, prayer services from Valley Beth Shalom. You're all welcome to join us. Nice bar mitzvah this morning at 11:30, 11:45. Rabbi Silverman has his insights in the Torah portion. Tonight, 6 o'clock, Yossi Dresner leads Mincha Maariv, and I'll be doing Havdalah on Zoom this afternoon. Tomorrow morning, Minyan at 8:30. During the week, Minyan at 7:30 in the morning, 6 o'clock in the evening. Lunch and Learn Wednesday afternoon. It's getting into our summer schedule, so the teaching schedule, the learning schedule is a little bit lighter, but we certainly are delighted to have you along. And stay well, take good care. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.